Good evening, everyone. And we are back in Deuteronomy, and today we are doing chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a very crucial chapter in the book of Deuteronomy because it encapsulates what the Bible compresses itself into two statements here that God uses to express his relationship with his people. Now, we have always looked at words like commandments, statutes, judgments, and I hope that we're able to unpack this today. Reading from verse 1, it says, "Now this is the commandment, statutes, and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land," right? In the land which you are crossing over to possess. Now let's begin unpacking this because each of these actually have context to the entire chapter. So this thing that Moses is saying, right? And by commandments, these would be the orders. I think the orders would be easy for us to understand. The laws or the orders, right? Or precepts. I think the easiest way to look at commandments would be when you tell your children to pick up the toys. That's a commandment. And when commandment goes, as you can tell, they are not optional. They are instructions that needs to be carried out. And so instructions that needs to be complied to. And the idea of these instructions is for the good of the person that is being instructed. And so commandment in this sense is very explicit that it is not an option for the listeners. And so the listeners being this new generation of Israelites. Statutes, on the other hand, statutes would be what we call ordinances, or what we call prescribed limits, right? Prescribed limits. The prescribed limits would be what we would call statutes. Prescribed limits. Now, the idea of limits is important because statutes, like any ordinances, provides the boundary, the border. This is the prescription of what you need to do. And basically, I think what is going to happen would be the commandment would be go bake a cake. And the cake is described as being good. And the statutes would be the recipe that goes with the cake. And this is what you need to do. 1 cup of flour, some eggs, and this is what you need to do. So these would be an equivalent of the statutes. And the judgments would be the justice. The justice would be the decisions that God makes in the event when things need to be decided on. And it would be, what do you do if you have something like this happening? What happens when there's non-compliance? And that would be judgments. And so when you put the three together, we have the idea of commandment, the laws, the instructions, the orders itself. The statutes would be like the recipe, the prescription, the limits, the boundaries, the ordinances. And the judgments would be the prescription of penalties, of non-compliance. What's going to happen when somebody doesn't do it? And hence, this is how the three would be easier to understand, to relate to each other. But these are not your normal instructions. These are instructions by Jehovah, your Elohim. And by invoking the name of God, it makes the commandments, statutes, and judgments to be particularly important and particularly serious because it has divine consequences. And hence chapter 6 gives us that idea. And so he says that he has commanded, he has given as an instruction to teach. And this comes from the idea of lamad. Lamad is to learn, and the intensive form is to teach. And so one has to do with learning so that God now uses that to teach them, to prod at them, and the idea of teaching in the ancient days, it's very much by the rod, right? To teach the ox how to move forward. You don't coax the ox, they use a stick to poke at the ox. That you may observe. Now, the idea of observe in verse 1 really is to perform, to do them. They are now in the wilderness. So is this the time for them to implement this? Obviously not. Apparently, it's meant for them to be in the land. And so the land means that they will be like Edom. They've taken over the Horites. They have now the land. The Moab took over the Emims. The Ammonites took over the Zamzumims. And so each of them inherited their land. And so they live in the land to govern the land. Now, in this land that God is going to give to them, called the Promised Land, that they are going to cross over to inherit or to take possession. Then in that land itself requires governance. And the governance will come from these three components: the law and order, the prescription limits, the justice and decisions, and this will govern their entire nation when they come to the land. Now, when they come into the land, it's their land, and so they need to have the rules to govern them. And because this is the land that God gave them, and incidentally, you need to remember that this land, although given to them, technically still belongs to God. So God keeps reminding them that this is my land and that I give it to you to possess so that you can use it, and that God's laws is to govern this people so that the nations around them looks at them and says, wow, they are a very different nation. The things that they do, they govern themselves, they have a different God. And this is to invoke fear of the Lord your God. What do you mean to invoke fear? The fear to God means to be always watchful, to keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you. And that is the demonstration of fear. See, the demonstration of fear is not to be so terrified that you are chair bound, that you don't know what to do. You fear the Lord by demonstrating that in everything they do, they make sure they are in compliance of his statutes. They would not run foul over the limits. And they will always remember what God has told them to do. That I have commanded you, but look at what keep. Keep means to keep it like a treasured heirloom that is for you, your son, the next generation, and your grandson, your son's sons, right? All the days of your life. It is not an option to do it once a while. It is to govern them for life. And so the laws of God, the statutes of God, and the judgments of God is to guard them, protect them, guide them, and instruct them in every facet of life that they live, that your days may be extended in the land. So always remember, this is referencing the land. So verse 3, therefore, Hear, O Israel. And this really tells them to hear. The hearing would be to listen and to do something about it. And this word, be careful to observe, is to keep and perform. So listen and be mindful, guard yourself to perform all these things. So commandments and statutes of God, by the way, are just like what I've mentioned. They're not options that God left with them. These are needful, mandatory compliance. And that it may be well, it may be good, it may be tov with you, that you may multiply greatly. The idea of multiply greatly is to grow in numbers. As the Lord your God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has promised you, and you're going into a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, literally, you find that this is an idiom. Flowing with milk and honey means it is a place that is very fertile, very rich, very rich, very fertile. It's literally flowing with milk and honey, and milk comes from their dairy animals, and the dairy animals need grass and pasture land, and there'll be plenty to eat for the animals, and thereby they give milk. And honey comes from two sources, the date palms as well as flowers. And in one passage in 1 Samuel, David went to hide from King Saul. He went into a cave where it was dripping with honey. The idea there is that there are so many flowers that the bees will manufacture so much honey that it will be flowing with it. And so that is what it means by a land flowing with milk and honey. It's not that you go to the river and the river, instead of water, you get honey. So this is an idiom, right? This is an idiom. It's a very rich and very fertile land. And so this is what God is giving them. With this, again, he says, "Hear, Shema Israel." And that's where we get the term Shema. This entire verse 4 and 5 is called the Shema, the hearing, the things to hear. Right? That's basically what it means. And so it says, hear. Hear who? O Israel, this generation of Israel and all Israel of all times. And the description here is very similar to Exodus chapter 20. It's similar to the chapter before when we talked about the 10 commandments. And you remember the 10 statements or the 10 commandments or the 10 Devarim is to introduce them to God, that God is the God who took them out of Egypt and they should have no other gods. And God is a Kana God, a jealous God. And so hear this. And this here is an imperative. Hear, O Israel, Jehovah our God. And this is by name. This is not any God, but it is God by name, Jehovah, our God. That includes Moses, Jehovah. Again, this is my name. Is Echad. And that is the meaning of one. This one, I think you would be able to refer to Zechariah 14:9. It says that God is one and God's name is one. His name is one. And the one literally means one, right? He is the only one God. There is no other gods, and you shall not have any other gods before me. And that's the context of Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus chapter 20. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, that you shall have no other gods before me. God is Echad. And by God is Echad, it leads on to verse 5. And verse 5 says this, and you will love. And the word love here is ahav. And you will love the Lord your God. Again, more specific, not just any God, but Jehovah, who is that one God. And you don't do it to anybody else. And what do you do? How do you love? How do you ahav God? By the way, the word ahav here in the idea of love comes from chapter 5, where it says, God loved your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the idea is when God loves, God gives. And the concept of love is one of giving. One of giving. So let me just put this down here. Ahav literally means to give. And so it's very similar to Oriental view. When you love someone, you give to somebody. And that is the action of love. So when you sit down and say, no, how does love look like? And so the imagery is one of giving. Obviously, there is an abstract form of love, right, where you feel the emotions of loving another person. But in a Hebrew view of the word, it's very similar to the Chinese as well, that when you love, you give. It's very practical. So when God says you shall love the Lord your God with everything, every part of your heart, every part of your nefesh, and every part of your strength or your might. So let me unpack this. All is every part. And heart means your mind, right? Your mind, your will. Nefesh, your soul. It means your entire being. Your strength, your possessions, everything you own. And so this is the description in the Hebrew of what this great commandment is all about. That you will love the Lord your God. You give to the Lord your God. You give to Jehovah, your Elohim. And that's what God means, right? Elohim. What do you give? Every part of your mind or your heart. And the Hebrew heart really is the mind. It is your will. It is a central core. Now, of course, in our Greco-Roman world, we think of the head as the mind, right? The brains. But in Hebrew, they don't point to the brains. They point to the heart. That is the controlling part of the body. And so give to God every part of your mind, everything that you think about, that you decide to do, your choices. That's your heart, your will. Every part of your soul, that of your desires, of your interest, of your entire person, right? And then everything of your strength or your meod. And this means that everything that you possess, that you give to God. And literally what you find in verse 5 as what is called the greatest commandment is that actually the idea of loving God is to give everything you are, you have, you are, and you will be to God. Things that you would choose, that is your to be, your soul, that your entire being, your entire desire, your entire person, right? And your might, everything you possess. And that is what God is telling Israel. says, listen, O Israel, Yehovah, our Elohim, Yehovah Echad. Yehovah is one. Yehovah is the one God. He is the one who took you out of Egypt and is bringing you into this land. And in this land, he is that same Yehovah, your God. And because he is the one, he is your husband. You are the wife, and you will give to him your every being. And that is the relationship of a husband and a wife. The relationship between God and his people. Now, of course, that one is really very much a model that I'm speaking of, but the intent is that the two are united as one, to cleave to one another. And God is doing the giving first and expect Israel to give back. And God has given Israel as a promise in a covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now the reminder is when you get into the land, I want you to give yourself back to me and obey what I tell you to do, because it's good. Because God is good. And everything that they do in terms of choosing your heart, your will to listen to the commandment of God, to keep and to perform it as your entire being, not just one hand, but your entire being, to honor God. And that everything they do, that they possess, that they harvest from the animals that they have, all the newborn, God says, well, give me as well. And God asks them eventually give the firstborn, the first fruits, so that they remember God, that everything they have comes from God. Now in verse 6, the expectation of God is that these words, now these words are the same. This is Devarim. By the way, Devarim is the Hebrew name for Deuteronomy, and it exists in 1 verse 1. And now everywhere you see it, which I command you today, shall be in your heart. See, in your heart. The intent of the heart, remember, is your will and is your mind. In the Hebrew context, heart is the central core that controls the being. And so all these things that God is giving, you must put it in your heart. Now, I guess in modern day, we say put it in your head. Remember it, right? And we do have another phrase that says, what comes into one ear, make sure it doesn't go out to the other ear, right? But the idea here is, it is a Hebrew expression. Keep it in your heart, in your lev, in the part where you make decisions. So that when you choose something, when you decide to do something, the commands of God, the words of God will be the guidance. And then you shall teach them diligently. Note this. You shall repeat. Teach them diligently means to repeat them to your sons. And then you shall talk of them, right? Speak. And so what we have is an A and a B. It's the emphasis is make sure that all these commandments is not forgotten, that you will tell them, repeat them. I guess we have this equivalent called grandfather stories. So you keep repeating everything over and over again. But the intent is when you keep repeating them, it really means that it will sharpen their senses. They will be reminded duly. So repeat them often. Talk about it often. When you sit in your house, when you walk by the road, when you lie down to sleep, and when you rise up from your bed. So you notice these are all the things that they will do, right? They sit in the tent, they walk on the journey, they lie down to sleep, and they wake up to go to work. Now that's the entire culture of the Hebrew people. And so when they rise up and go out, of course, they will tend to their agriculture, they will tend to their flocks. And that's what Moses is saying. You shall repeat them when you stand up and cook. You talk about it. When you jalan and walk your way, you talk about it. When you lie down to sleep and before they close their eyes, you talk about it. When you sit in your house sipping tea, you talk about it. When you rise up, you thank God and you talk about it. And so you notice they've got lots to talk about. So when the Israelites are supposed to sit together, they don't talk about the European Cup, right? They don't talk about the football or the durian season. They actually talk about the commands, statutes, and judgments of God. Now, verse 8 gives them a very peculiar behavior, something that they do, that you shall bind. Bind is to tie, right? Tie them. What is them? The commands. As a sign on your hand, right? As a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. Which means that when you move your hand and you do things, you are duly reminded of the commands of God. And when you look at things, so you look at the purpose of this command is that when you are doing something, right? When you are doing something with your hands, you will see it as a sign. When you look at things, you will see it in your eyes, in your vision. Then the last one here is when you walk out of your house and out of your gates, you write them on the doorposts. And so what they do is that they literally have this, like the mezuzot. So if they have a door, they would write it in a little container, maybe metal or whatever it may be, roll in a scroll, and then they will nail it to the door. So when they walk in and walk out, they will actually see the blessings of God to bring shalom to them. But they are taking write the commands of God. With regards to these binding as frontlets on the hands, they actually tie them on their heads like a little box, right? And then if they have the hand, they will also tie it to their hands, right? These are all little boxes. And in the box, they contain the commands. And they tie it to the heads and tie it to the box. Now, these are all very, well, today we call it very Jewish, but literally, when you look at verse 8 and 9, that's what exactly they do. And the intent, the principle being, is that number one, they will know that they are different from all other nations. The other nations look at them and they are all very different from the other nations as well. And they treat the commands of God very literally and very seriously. They are not afraid nor ashamed to look different and to behave different, mainly because these are God's divine commands. And that is important. Now, these little boxes are called tefillin, and the things that is nailed to the door is called the mezuzot. But the idea here is God wants them to be reminded that what they look at with their eyes, what they do with their hands, are governed by the commands of God. And when they walk out of the door, out of their tent, out of the gates, and when they come back, they are duly reminded that the instructions of God is what governs their lives. So the first 9 verses really wraps and defines their culture. And that is how serious God wants them to treat his words. And I think that is something which is commendable. It's something for us to think about as well. Now, if you remember, it comes in threes, right? The command, statutes, and judgments. Verse 10 gives you the conditions, the judgments, perhaps, if you want to look at that. All right. And so it shall be when the Lord your God, that Jehovah brings you into the land of which he swore to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You will always see these reminding, right? We've been seeing Exodus 19 constantly being reminded, but throughout the rest of the Old Testament, you would find the reminder that this is what God had sworn, had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God loved Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by loving, it's not the feeling, it is the giving of the covenant and the land to give you large, beautiful cities which you did not build. When you go in, they take over somebody else's cities. Houses full of all good things which you did not fill. It was filled by somebody else. Hewn out wells. You know, wells in the land is actually a hole in the ground, and they have to dig to the aquifer to get to the water table, which you did not dig. Vineyards and olive trees, which you did not plant, and they're all over the place. When you have eaten and are full. Now, again, I want to point out these things. Typical Oriental expressions. Eat and drink. Eat and drink. Like us. When we sit down and we think, oh, what should we do? Then we'll be thinking about eating and drinking. Well, the Israelites are exactly the same. When you eat and are filled, then comes the judgments of God. Beware, lest you forget. Remember what it means to forget? The idea of forget means to ignore, right? It means to be oblivious, to misplace the words of God. That it is Jehovah who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remember the reminder, the greatest series of miracles that were done and never done again from the house of servitude, of servanthood. And basically, remember, we talked about this, when you're out of the land of Egypt from the house of servanthood, they become the people of God to be servants of God. Instead, man is made to serve, and you either serve which master you choose. And God made sure that they were brought out of Egypt so that they can serve Jehovah God, and that you shall fear the Lord your God. Fear, be afraid. Why should they be afraid? They should be afraid of God so that they will serve him and take oaths in his name, because God will judge. Right? God will judge. This is very important. God judges. And that's why they have to fear. If God doesn't judge, man will never fear God. And so when God gave commandments and ordinances, he always gave judgments so that man will fear God. That if you do something wrong, something can happen if they don't repent. And so you must fear God. Now, this is not reverential fear, by the way. I think in the modern terms, we have kind of watered it down. So it would be very Oriental. In the past, you know, that the ancient fathers are very strict, and the children will think 3 times before they decide to do something. And that's what it means by fear. to make sure that everything they do in service and taking oaths are not whimsical, that it is serious, that they will do exactly as they are told. Number 14, verse 14, do not go after other gods. The gods of the people are all around you. Make sure you are not distracted. Remember Deuteronomy 5, 4, as well as Exodus chapter 20. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not have any graven images. Why do you think God keeps reminding them? Isn't once enough? And the answer is no. If you truly love God, you will not serve other gods. When you serve other gods, then you are not obeying the Lord your God. You're not hearing the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. For the Lord your God is a Kana God. Remember yesterday we talked about it. Every time God repeats all these things in such tight configuration within a few chapters, tells us that there is an emphasis that you please do not forget. Lest the anger of the Lord your God be aroused against you and destroy you from the face of the earth. Judgment. So you can see the commands of God and the statutes of God always comes with judgment of God. And the judgment would talk about the consequences of decisions when you do not comply. Hence, God says, I give you the land, and it is with condition. God did not give the land to the Israelites so that they can worship other gods. God brought them out of Egypt so that this is the people that he can use to show the world, all the nations around them, that God is a true and living God. God is a holy God, and this is a holy nation, a special nation before God. How the priests serve is different from the priests of other gods. Verse 16, and you will find this, that you shall not tempt the Lord your God. What do you mean, tempt the Lord your God? The idea of tempt here is to try, to prove, right? To, how else you say? To test God's patience. I think that would be a way to do it. To test God's patience. Don't try, because when God is angry, you don't like. You don't like God when he is angry. So don't test God's anger. Don't test God's patience, right? Because they did that. They tested him. Where? In Massa, with the bitter water. Remember, in Massa. And this would be in Exodus chapter 17. And they thought that to God that, oh, why bring them out of Egypt? They've got no water to drink. The water is bitter. No, are they supposed to die in the wilderness? And that's trying to provoke God. And that's what it means by do not tempt God, right? It is not about temptation of sin. This is really to test God's patience. And so verse 17, you must diligently keep. You must very much keep or guard the commandments of the Lord your God, his testimonies. These would be reminders. His statutes, his ordinances, which he has commanded you. And you shall do what is right and good. Notice the last phrase, in the sight of the Lord. And what does that mean? In the eyes of the Lord. So to do what is right. What do you mean what is right? What is correct? Right? What is straight? What is good is what is tov, what is agreeable in the eyes of the Lord. So look at this. What is right and good is also depending on who is looking at it. If it is about ourselves, so what we look at the situation, then it will be tov to us because it agrees with us. But here in verse 18, God is saying, you shall perform everything that is correct in the eyes of God, that is right and good and agreeable in the eyes of God. And the consequence would be that it will be also good with you, that you may go in and inherit, take over the good land of which the Lord swore to your fathers, to cast out all your enemies before you as the Lord has spoken. So you notice how many times good, that it may be good, that you may go in and possess the good land. And it's all from the eyes of God. And when the eyes of God sees what is agreeable, that is tov, and then it will be tov with them. And they will be living in a tov land. That's the play of this word tov. We come to the last stage, the last part. And when your son, this is interesting because it is always relating to the next generation. That the keeping, the guarding of God's command is not just for them, it's to pass down. And so when your son learns about this, then it is applying to his son and his son's son, right? And when your son asks you, and the idea of asking is to inquire, just like all children do. Why, Father? Why? In time to come, when you go in, you get married, you have children, your son will ask you, what is the reminder, statutes, and judgments which Jehovah, our Elohim, have commanded you? And this must be a test, right? The reminders, the ordinances, and the decisions, so that they will continue to keep, and that they will then tell it to their sons, and their sons will learn about all this to tell it to their sons. You notice what is God doing? God is making sure that Israel, as a nation, shall not forget his words. And then you shall say to your son, we were servants. I don't like the word slaves, but I guess we were servants. We had to listen to some masters of Pharaoh in Egypt. And Jehovah brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched hand. Remember, we read all this in Exodus chapter 19 and 20 as well. With a mighty hand, a hand of strength. And the Lord Jehovah showed signs and wonders before our eyes. We saw that great and severe. It is so intense and awesome that it destroyed literally Egypt. Against Egypt, the Pharaoh, all his household, and by saying that, all the gods of the land. Then he brought us out from there that he might bring us in. You notice in Hebrew, you leave somewhere, you've got to go someplace. There is no such thing of leaving and then you're hanging in midair. There is always a right hand and the left hand. You don't wander to the left, you don't wander to the right. What is in front, there is also the back. So there's always these pairs. All right. So he brought us out and he will bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Lord commanded us to observe. In 24, the word observe is to perform. Everything of these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, to explain to them, you must be afraid of the Lord our God because he is our judge. There is judgment. You need to be careful. There is no such thing called chintai or simply do. Because as the Lord commands, and so the behavior and attitude is one of fear, that you are mindful all the time that what you look at, what you see, and what your hands do, and where you go, you're duly reminded of the commands of God. And it is for our good, our tov, always, all the time, that He might preserve us alive. And this is the idea, to keep alive. And to keep the nation alive. See, God wants a nation to progress and persist and to be preserved, but it is conditional on the relationship of Israel with God, that they do not serve other gods, that they should hear God, they should love God, or ahav, Jehovah, their Elohim, with all their heart and all their nefesh and all their me'od, their might, as it is this very day, this day, specific, this same day that they're talking about, this very day, that it will be righteousness for us. And the idea of righteousness means it's justice. It is right. It's a right thing for us. Why? Because God brought us out, God brought us in. And so listening to God is a right thing. Obeying God is a right thing. Fearing God is a right thing. Remembering God is a right thing. And that is what it means here. It is righteousness. It's a right thing for us. If we are careful, we guard, and then to observe means to do, to perform. And I like this word. This is a big 3-letter word, right? All. Every one of these commandments. And this is the point. Before the Lord our God. Before the Lord our God literally means to the faces of Jehovah. Meaning this, that all these commandments are to be done, executed. Be very careful to do it, that they are not simply doing it and they're doing it according to what God has said. And it is done in a way as if it is in front of the face of God, that God is watching. That is how this phrase is. The phrase is lipanai, Jehovah, to the face of God, as He has commanded us. Just like the parent instructing the child, pick up your toys. To the child's perspective, the parent has spoken. The parent has commanded. And now the parent is waiting for the child to listen, to obey. And this is basically how chapter 6 of Deuteronomy is all about. That God has commanded, and we are to keep telling the next generation, you to the next, to the next. And this is what it means to keep, to guard, so that it's protected, and that the next generation will know what to do, what to say, and then the next, and then the next. Because the word of God is an heirloom. It is an heirloom that defines them, defines the children of God, defines the people of God. And I would submit to you, it is to describe the character of God. Everything in the commands speaks about the character of God. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 6.